again, a very warm welcome. There's still people coming. We're overwhelmed by the huge interest in this event tonight, that so many people have joined us for the live stream. A very warm welcome to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and a warm welcome to all those joining us via live stream tonight. We're particularly delighted to have viewers from the USA and from the African continent today. My name is Kirsten Krampe, and I am at the head of the Africa department at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in this house. Before we start, allow me a brief technical note. My colleague has already mentioned this. This is a bilingual event in German and English. Please help yourselves to the headsets, and we will have simultaneous translation here in the booth by the two interpreters helping us. So for all those who don't have a headset, please grab a headset at the entrance so that we will improve communication. The movie has subtitles, so it will not be translated. So it will be in English and German, and you'll be able to follow it. Having said so, we are delighted to be able to screen the documentary entitled Echoes Across the Atlantic here at the Böll Foundation today. This film, which is having its world premiere here today, so to speak, follows 12 activists from the Berlin Remembrance Working Group at the Theodor Heuss High School, who, on a trip to New Orleans in the USA last year, explored the aftermath of the transatlantic histories of violence. In doing so, they listened to the descendants of enslaved people and formally put themselves in the picture at the memorial sites. For the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, this project is particularly important for several reasons. It links Germans' remembrance works, particularly concerning the Holocaust, with transatlantic histories of enslavement, colonialism, and racism, issues that are still too often treated separately or ignored altogether in Germany. This movie shows that remembrance works becomes politically relevant when connections are made visible between historical crimes and contemporary inequalities, between local experiences and global power structures, between personal experience and social responsibility. This project is so powerful because it shows how young people with diverse family histories and backgrounds turn remembrance into a political and democratic project in search of complexity and their own connections. And this is often achieved because remembrance is not imposed, but remains open to one's own origins, the suffering endured in their own family history, the experience of being an outsider and belonging and empathy for others, without hierarchies of suffering. And it succeeds because remembrance is not understood as a closed space, but as a practice of relationship building. The young people do not merely appropriate history, they enter into a dialogue with this history and with the people whose lives are still shaped today by this history. We would therefore like to extend our heartfelt thanks to everyone who has made this project possible. I extend a very warm welcome for all of you for coming here. Thanks for being present at this event. And of course, there are a lot of things first and foremost, because particular projects needs also a particular commitment. Thanks to all those who have made possible Echoes Across the Atlantic. First of all, Sabeth Schmidthaus from the Theodor Heuss High School. Thank you. She has supported the work of the group Remembrance Erinnern for many years with great commitment that extends far beyond the school context. Our thanks also go to the members of the working group, but whose families accompany them on this journey and supported this project in a very special way. I've lived that myself. Sabet and has asked me from a very early stage on, for example, for raising funds, which seemed almost hopeless in the beginning. So many applications have been made, so many discussions were needed with the donors, and then again and again the rejections that had to be endured. We had to set up our own crowdfunding campaign and a flea market that was born from very spontaneous ideas. So you engaged yourselves, and it worked in the very end. A very great thank also to Moritz Richard Schmidt for, you will see it, his excellent film work. He succeeds in bringing these experiences, thanks to this movie, to life with sensitivity, precision, and without oversimplification. And I can also tell you, well, it's a world premiere, as I've already said. There is a huge demand for this movie, and Maria Kind, who has co-hosted this event today, that I'd like to thank particularly, has already told us that you will show this movie in a lot of places, even unusual places, everywhere. I'd like to mention also the great accordance with the Böll Foundation's office in Washington, which are not with us tonight, but maybe digitally, which helped arrange the flights for the group and thus provided crucial support for the trip to New Orleans. We are particularly delighted to welcome today's international guests here in the first row, Dr. Joy Banner, Dr. Carlos Hill, and Bernard Dahondi, who you will see and listen to in the film later on in their different roles and positions. More than a year ago, Carlos, we talked to each other via Zoom, and you were decisive in realizing this project. You have developed and followed this idea. You supported us, and this is why I'm so touched that you are here with us tonight. Last but not least, I am delighted that Josephine Abraka will be hosting this evening. Hello, Josephine. I'd like to introduce you very shortly. She is an African studies scholar, author, and a coach. Her work focuses indeed on memory, history, power relations, and social change. For many years, Josephine Abraka has been engaged with German colonial history and colonial continuity, including in the context of renaming streets in with colonial connotations in Berlin's so-called African Quarter. Several of her children's books and non-fiction works address issues of discrimination, belonging, and social responsibility. So who better to guide us through this evening? Many thanks to Josephine. Thank you for being here and guiding us and moderating this evening. But before handing over to Josephine, I'd like to hand over the floor to Sabbath to give us an introduction in how this project was born. Sabbath, please. Thank you, Kirsten. Also, very warm welcome from my side, and also on behalf of the working group Remembrance Erinnern. I'm truly overwhelmed by the huge interest in today's event. I'm delighted to see so many family members of the young people in the working group Remembers, and so many colleagues from our high school, Theodor Heuss, and of course a warm welcome to our friends from across the Atlantic. I must admit, honestly, for many weeks and months, I didn't really believe that we would manage to travel to New Orleans, that this project would take place, and certainly not that this movie would be made. And both have become a reality. And it could only happen because so many people helped and supported us. And therefore, I'd like to take this opportunity to say an individual thank you to some of our supporters. First of all, a thank you to our over 100 private donors. The crowdfunding has been mentioned already. Thank you to David Rust from Weihnachtszauber Christmas Market. Thank you to Mehtap Selçuk from Anchor Nursing Practice and to Nisa Rogbani from the Schulze Hotel. Those are our main donor partners. But, of course, a very special thanks to the Heinrich-Böll Foundations. Without you, this project would never have taken place. Thanks to your financial support. Thank you to Kirsten Kamper and Maria. But I'd also like to thank Lily Stolzler. I think it was in 2022. I don't remember whether it was 21 or 22. In any way, Lily got to know our working group, Remembrance, in the context of our activities with the Obermeyer Foundations and widened the circle. And ever since, Lily has been supporting us and standing by our side with advice and action. Thank you so much, Lily. Dear Remembrance Group, dear adolescents, all those who have become young adults, some of you have been with us for more than 11 years. A very warm thanks also for you, for your constant commitment and against racism and anti-Semitism. And I am totally conscious that it's not so easy to stay engaged again for this. Thank you for your endurance, but thank you also for demanding that we engage with the era of colonialism and the enslavement of the peoples of Africa. Thank you for your reminder that we should not forget this part of German history as well. And the fact that we were able to engage with this history in such an impressive way is thanks to Carlos Hill. He's a professor of the University of Oklahoma for African American history. Thank you so much, Carlos, for your never-ending support, for your expertise, and for your friendship. I very much hope that over the next year we will succeed in implementing the final part of our triangle of colonialism project. This is how we called it. Hopefully, we will be able to complete it during the next year, in which we intend to focus on the African perspective next. If there's anybody here in the room who has an idea on how we might go about it, to implement it, meaning clearly how to finance this last part of this project, well, I'm open to these ideas. But now I'll come to the most important people of this evening. Thank you so much, Joy and Bernard, for coming all the way from the US and Tanzania to attend our event. And last but not least, Moritz, thank you. What our filmmaker, Moritz Schmidt, has achieved in the recent years is simply incredible. He has not only been following our Remembrance Group since the Obermeyer Awards for the last 6 years, not only with his camera, but like Lily, he has become part of our group. He has also become a close friend, a part of our group. In 2024, he created the impressive film Echoes of Remembrance, and now I'm delighted and very excited about watching Echoes Across the Atlantic. So many thanks, Moritz, for all your commitment. Thank you. Before starting the movie, a few words on this film. This is not a classical travelogue or travel documentation. It's not only about giving information. It accompanies young people during their trip with meeting people on remembrance, on responsibility, and on historical connections. In the center, there's not only the past, but also what history does with us today. What changes if we do not only treat historical subjects in school, but that we meet history through places, through people? What changes in our perspective when we meet those who have followed, who are the inheritance of a culture, of a history? So this is a real opening of a space of experience to perceive connections and the impressions that you will live during this film. We will take them up during this panel discussion. So I wish you a very interesting movie now and a good panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Reflecting on the sacrifices of enslaved ancestors demands an honest reckoning with the immense suffering they endured during the transatlantic slave trade and slavery itself. To honor them is to let their memory burn bright within us, a sacred flame that calls us to remember and to speak their names. Speak their names and to build a world worthy of their unbreakable spirit.
Cecil George, Cecil George, Cecil George. Everybody worked, young and old. If you could only carry 2 or 3 sugarcane, you worked. No school, no church on Sunday night.
Francis Darby, Francis Darby, Francis Darby. Age 100 years old. Out in the camp, out yonder in the camp, near the cane fields, the all women, too old to work and too old to make the babies.
Carly Stewart, Carly Stewart, Carly Stewart. I was 7 years old when we were set free.
Die AG Erinnern ist ja eigentlich eine AG, die sich seit 10 Jahren mit dem Thema Nationalsozialismus und Holocaust beschäftigt. 2017 ist gegenüber unserer Schule der Gedenkort Güterbahnhof Moabit entstanden. Der erinnert an die von dort deportierten Jüdinnen und Juden im Jahr 1942 bis 1944. Und im Zuge dessen ist eben auch der Professor Carlos Hill dazugekommen. Und der hat eigentlich festgestellt, die Arbeit, die ihr hier am Gedenkort macht, ist ganz ähnlich wie die Arbeit, die ich in der USA mache.
I met AG Remembrance in the summer of 2022 at Track 69, where they were engaged in sharing the history of that site and why they do the work of helping the Berlin community, but also Germany, understand the importance of that site. And so I've always seen AG Remembrance, led by Zabet Schmidthaus, as remembrance activists doing some of the most important remembrance work around the Holocaust in Berlin. As a student group, but also as a larger working group.
Und so hat quasi unsere Verbindung angefangen zu Black History, Kolonialgeschichte und Sklaverei.
Carlos war oder ist bis heute ein ganz wichtiger Door-Opener.
Many of them said to me that they never thought that they could ever go to the United States. And so from that moment, it inspired me to try to figure out ways to create tours for remembrance activists in the United States that would help expose them to something that I know and care a lot about, that is Black history. For me, it's been about honoring that connection, that I met them engaged in remembrance activism. Some of the first conversations I had with them were about how can we learn about what you're doing in the U.S. And so that conversation is still ongoing.
Erstmal angekommen, für mich war das erste Mal in Amerika, deswegen alles war groß, alles war neu. Ich habe mir alles angeguckt, da waren die Palmen, die großen Autos, viele Menschen. Du hast schon so eine andere Stimmung, eine andere Atmosphäre gespürt.
Alive. Also das ist so, ich glaube, das ist so das Wort, was ich am besten benutzen würde, um diese Stadt auch zu beschreiben.
New Orleans was the ideal spot for us to learn about slavery and the slave trade, but it was also a great place for us to learn about American culture, African American culture.
Während dieser Vorbereitung ist uns eigentlich schon klar geworden, wie eng deutsche Geschichte mit der Geschichte New Orleans, der Stadt, zu tun hat oder auch überhaupt mit dem transatlantischen Sklavenhandel. Die ersten Siedler oder mit die ersten Siedler in New Orleans waren Deutsche. Die ersten Plantagen, die dort errichtet wurden, waren in Besitz von Deutschen, nicht nur, aber auch. Und die gesamte Region hat bis heute den Namen German Coast.
It just made sense for us to come and to understand, in a place not very many Germans know of a connection with their country, with their past, with their history. As remembrance workers, it was really important for us to try to think about what does this history mean for us.
Wir haben ein German American Culture Zentrum besucht, die eben sehr stark immer noch ihre deutsche Vergangenheit betonen.
Da waren manche halt so es hat die stutzig gemacht, dass da nur so positive Aspekte gezeigt wurden von diesen Siedlern.
Also diese Sprache, wie man die Sprache nutzt, das ist mir so hart aufgefallen. Und ich glaube, das ist mir noch nie so bewusst geworden, dass ein Wort die ganze Geschichte verändern kann. Das ist dieser Unterschied zwischen Immigrant, also du bist ein Migrant, du kommst in ein Land und du sagst, so, hier lebe ich jetzt, ich lebe unter der Regel des Landes, in dem ich bin. Oder du gehst in ein anderes Land und sagst, so, das ist jetzt meins, hier gelten jetzt meine Regeln. I asked him if it's the wrong wording to say German immigrants if they were settlers. It changes the perspective of history because immigrants is not the same as settlers.
Yes.
And then he asked me like this really provoking question. So, do you think I am the descendant of a settler? And I was like, yes, you are. That's literally the definition of. I don't want to say what you are, but if you ask me like that, then yes, you are. But then you have to accept that if you want to be German so badly, you are the descendant of German settlers.
Yeah, and that's why it's very important to difference between settler and immigrant.
I think we still need to clarify, and that is kind of the part that I was missing at the German American Cultural Center, because it is, in fact, history of the Germans here, that you immigrated into an established system that you are ultimately, because of the color of your skin, profiting from. Again, we were talking a lot about wording and how the narrative can be changed depending on who's telling the story and what words they use and what their point of view is. If we forget or just don't add that part, then we are erasing a part of history. That system that has been built in this country, erasing the indigenous people, enslaving black people, forcing them to labor to build everything in this country, that is an established system. So as a white person, I immigrated into that system.
Everything that is happening in America from 1619 till the nearly the 20th century, we can think about it as a part of America's colonial creation, colonial development. Even immigrants, German immigrants who never joined the slaveholding class, that never own a slave, they still nonetheless participate in a system built on slavery that informs everything that happens in society, and therefore, on a deeper level, to live in American society as a white person is what truly determined whether you benefited from the system or whether you were a victim of the system. And so I think those conversations that we had forced us to really think hard about the institution of slavery.
This marker here that was created in 2018, 300 years after slavery began in New Orleans, is really, really important.
Und wir waren im Hafen von New Orleans, wo eben die versklavten Menschen ankamen. Und dort war eine Tafel, auf der genannt wurden, von welchen Völkern, afrikanischen Völkern die Menschen dorthin kamen.
Und da stand halt dann auch die verschiedenen Tribes. Und da habe ich natürlich mein Tribe wiedergefunden, Ibibio Tribe. Dieser Moment war nicht geplant. Der Moment war einfach, also ich glaube auch nochmal von mir aus zu zeigen, dass ich angesprochen bin, dass das wirklich meine Identität auch ist.
Also Blessing ist seit Jahren und auch ihre Schwester war in meiner Klasse Teil dieser AG und sie stand direkt neben uns, quasi. Also die Geschichte war mit uns. Keiner konnte irgendwie was sagen und dann war ich so krass, du stehst hier mit uns, du leistest diese Arbeit und dann siehst du einfach, du bist wortwörtlich Teil der Geschichte.
The real goal that I have is for the students to have much greater compassion and empathy for the history of enslaved people and how that history informs today. Because if you are only compassionate about what happened to enslaved people, but not their descendants, then there's a missing link.
The transatlantic slave trade is the largest forced migration in world history. More human beings, not just the 12.5 million that actually were brought to the Americas, but it's also the other 12.5 million or so that never made it to the shores because they died along the way.
Specifically, New Orleans, as a remembrance site, is a site where the most well-preserved plantations and slave quarters that are in the United States, but it's also the site of where, with those well-preserved plantations, they are also telling the most descendant-based stories about slavery, the slave trade. And so for me, the overarching goal was for us to learn the history of slavery, slave trade in the New Orleans region from Black descendants, to learn from them why this history matters so much today.
Whitney Plantation is about remembrance. So at the Whitney Plantation, we are the first plantation museum that became more so centered around the experiences of enslaved people.
Das klingt paradox, wenn ich es sage, aber es sieht sehr schön aus dort und es war auch ein schöner Ort.
Das könnte auch ein Urlaubsort sein, weißt du? Würden sich da Menschen nicht einsetzen dafür, dass an diese Geschichte erinnert wird, dann würde man vergessen, was da eigentlich für eine Geschichte passiert ist und was dort Menschen angetan worden ist.
Als wir da bei gefühlt 40 Grad rumgelaufen sind und dann das Metallgefängnis gesehen haben, wo sie uns erzählt haben, dass da, ich glaube, bis zu 14 Sklaven pro Zelle eingepfercht wurden, mitten auf dem Feld. Da ist mir das dann aufgefallen, wo wir denn gerade wirklich sind.
Die Leute mussten es dort auch drin mehrere Tage aushalten und boah, ey, das hat dann auch nochmal was mit mir angestellt, weil das halt einfach wirklich so menschenverachtend, unmenschlich, so ein Verhalten, ja.
Also über die Plantage zu laufen, war sehr emotional und hat so ein bisschen ähnliche Gefühle erweckt, wie wenn man durch ein KZ gelaufen sind. Wir haben ja dieses eine Haus gesehen, wo zum Beispiel diese Tonsteine auf dem Boden, wo man Fingerabdrücke von den Kindern sehen konnte. Wenn man sowas live sieht, was so wirklich eine Spur davon ist, ich habe das Gefühl, erst dann kann man richtig eine Verbindung ziehen. Das hat das Ganze noch mal richtig real gemacht. Und ich glaube, jetzt mittlerweile bin ich einfach nur noch wütend.
Remembrance for me in my everyday life is constant. I always say that I live in the shadow of my ancestors. Between my place of employment and my home, there are about 6 plantations that I pass by on a daily basis. It's hard to miss. Every time I pass by these plantations, I'm thinking if their spirits are still there, if they can hear me talking about them. So I'm actually descended from people who were enslaved on many of these plantations in the area. You know, this is my family. I'm not just talking about strangers that I'm reading about in a book. This is people who I probably wouldn't have learned about if I haven't come to Whitney myself. Whitney Plantation is about education. It is about a part of history that has long been glossed up. Whitney Plantation is about giving a voice to those whose memories, whose names, whose voices were buried with the passage of time. The first time I realized that this work was more than just a job, I wasn't even really doing tours yet. I was still in my training period. This was when I took a walk around the grounds for myself for the first time, and I came across the 1811 slave revolt. This is one of the biggest slave revolts in U.S. history, yet a lot of us, including me and my grandparents, and we've lived along the River Road our entire lives. We didn't even know that this revolt even took place. It made me realize how easily history is buried when people don't talk about it.
So Woodland, this is the origin site of the plantation where the largest slave rebellion happened in the United States, what we believe to be. We're still putting together a lot of the information and the research about the rebellion because it is virtually unknown. What we call them fellow freedom seekers, other enslaved people, made the strike against the plantation owners, the plantation systems to fight for their freedom. And that first strike happened at this house. And many of the freedom seekers were killed at that site. The remaining ones were brought to several plantations along the river and in New Orleans. About 60 of them were sentenced to death. After they were sentenced, and after that sentence was delivered, their heads were cut off and placed on pikes along the river to send the message that this is what happens when you fight for your freedom. And those freedom fights are also being informed by, the American Revolution. You know, that's also being informed, well, now we're going forward into liberté, égalité, fraternité. So these movements for freedom and liberation, they are the same desire, but it's who gets those rights to freedom, who's believed to be a patriot, who gets the patriot label, and who gets the rebellion label.
gerade in der Bourbon Street. Wie ihr sehen könnt, ist hier sehr viel los. Es sind sehr viele Menschen draußen. Sie feiern den 4th of July, Independence Day. Es ist sehr viel Musik, gute Laune, Leute sind am Tanzen und wir mittendrin. Und jetzt suchen wir jemanden, den wir interviewen können.
So yeah, like I said, we're a study group from Germany. So the question is also, what does the 4th of July mean to you?
4th of July, Rise Up Right Now is just nothing but a movie that Will Smith was in. So at the end of the day, did it really affect us? You know what I'm saying? Are we getting any gains from it? No. We got a free day off of work. Yes, hallelujah.
4th of July means nothing to black people, actually. America does not care about us or our freedom or anything. It's all about them. So 4th of July is really another white holiday in America.
Don't have a problem with plantations when they're telling the story. Give us the respect, give our ancestors the respect of telling the accurate history. I don't have a problem. If you're not telling the history right, it's a traumatic experience. We had just gotten tired with we are tired with the narratives of plantations not being told within these plantation tours. We're tired of our tourist commission extracting from the tourism industry and the plantation tourism industry and not involving the black descendant community in the economic justice of it all. And we're tired of people attacking our community with industrialization and pollution. And so it was the impetus, the intersection of all those three things that was the motivation behind the Descendants Project.
What we as a Descendants Project do, and what informs us, is that we do put the memory and the action together. So Joe and I, we created this organization to celebrate that culture, but also to protect it. And that means fighting against land displacement, and then also fighting for healthy, clean air and environment. We are known as Cancer Alley as a result of that industrialization. I come from a long history of what seems hopeless to other people when I'm engaged in and when I'm immersed in history of enslaved people, who literally were someone else's property. If they have hope, then I can have hope. And I tell people, my community is so powerful, my culture and heritage is so magical that it heals me. I love it. It is the love of my life. Louisiana is the love of my life, and I'm immensely happy doing this work. And I just want to share that joy and happiness with people. And I also remind people too that hope, as a Black American, is to be hopeful always. We know hope. Hope is a muscle. I think hope is a muscle for Black people.
We've talked about all the ways in which enslaved people, despite all kinds of brutalities suffered, still survived, and one could even say created situations upon which Black people thrive. But to only expose students to how Black people were victimized and not how they created culture, how they created community, how enslaved people were resilient under those brutalities, would leave students with an inauthentic understanding. And so that vitality has been reflected in the food that emerges out of slavery: gumbo, jambalaya. You have spirituals that became the basis for blues and jazz music.
Ich bin da rumgelaufen und ich wurde immer angelächelt. Mir wurde so oft gesagt, dass mein Hijab richtig schön aussieht. Oder mir wurde auch manchmal Salam Alaikum gesagt. Ich fand das richtig toll. Und ich habe also wirklich so schöne Menschen dort getroffen. Also die Stadt ist wunderbar. Ich habe mich wirklich verliebt in sie. Ich glaube, die Musik hat auch so viel dafür gesorgt, dass es immer gute Laune war. Also ich finde es bemerkenswert und aber auch sehr bewundernd, weil obwohl ich jetzt so eine schlimme Geschichte habe, lassen wir uns nicht unterkriegen und kreieren dann etwas so Schönes wie zum Beispiel Musik zusammen. Und es ist ja ein Weg, um Menschen zusammenzubringen.
unabhängig von unserem Programm in New Orleans gab es so viele Menschen, die wir auf den Straßen kennengelernt haben und mit denen wir gesprochen haben.
Ja, es ist halt verrückt, wie viel man über andere Menschen lernt, wenn man bereit ist zuzuhören.
Ich finde, Menschlichkeit ist sehr wichtig. Also ich finde diesen Begriff an sich manchmal so absurd. Da steckt ja das Wort Mensch drin und dass so viele Menschen nicht mal das hinbekommen, ist schon bescheuert.
Wir haben ja dann auch unsere kleine Commemoration dort gehabt. Die fand ich auch richtig schön. Die Rede von Carlos, wie wir unsere Stimmen sozusagen genutzt haben, um die Stimmen von den Verstorbenen wieder ins Leben zu rufen. Das war so am Ende der Reise und nochmal uns sozusagen in den Kopf rufen, warum wir das alles machen, um sozusagen für die zu sprechen, die gar nicht sprechen können oder nicht mehr sprechen können.
Ey, das sind im Endeffekt wirklich so Menschen gewesen, nur weil sie eine andere Hautfarbe hatten und eine andere Sprache gesprochen hatten, eine andere Kultur hatten, wurde auf die herabgeschaut und es wurde so mit denen umgegangen. Ja, also ich kann es gar nicht in Wort fassen, weil mich das so mitnimmt, auch wenn ich jetzt wieder daran denke.
Die Reise nach New Orleans hat viel Traurigkeit und Scham hinterlassen. Scham einfach, weil wir das gar nicht aufarbeitet haben in Deutschland, habe ich das Gefühl.
Weil wir in Deutschland wirklich fast gar nicht darüber lernen.
Wie kann das sein? Vor allen Dingen wir als Vorreiter der Gedenkkultur. Ja, wir haben einen kleinen Teil aufgearbeitet, aber das ganze andere, was wir gemacht haben, ist halt, da stehen wir irgendwie noch. Wir stehen noch vor dem Anfang.
Manche fragen sich ja halt einfach so, warum sollte ich mich mit dem Holocaust oder mit Kolonialismus beschäftigen, wenn man keine Verbindung zu eines der beiden Themen hat.
Diese Frage finde ich provozierend, auch wenn die nicht böse gemeint ist. Warum setzt du dich damit auseinander? Es ist nicht deine Geschichte. Und dann denke ich mir so, doch, es ist meine Geschichte. Blickt zurück, setzt euch mit der Geschichte auseinander. Überall gibt es Verbindungen, überall gibt es Ketten. Wäre das eine nicht passiert, gäbe das andere nicht. Das ist die Geschichte von uns allen.
These histories are not separate, you know. These histories, they are really connected. I think that's the only process where you bring all this connection and try to change how people think about responsibility. So the only way to change this or to challenge that is to bring about or to add more to the or to widen the lens.
Ich glaube, das, was für mich zumindest bislang geblieben ist oder nachwirkt, ist die Frage, was bedeutet Erinnerungskultur heute?
Ich denke, dass gerade die Auseinandersetzung mit der Geschichte des Kolonialismus, aber auch die Auseinandersetzung mit der Geschichte des Nationalsozialismus da eigentlich eine ganz große Rolle spielt, weil sie sozusagen von frühen Strukturen, von Ideologien der Ungleichwertigkeit erzählt. Ja? Von Antisemitismus, von Rassismus, von verschiedenen Formen von Rassismus. Diese Geschichten auf eine Art und Weise zu erzählen, dass Personen einerseits sozusagen sich empathisch beziehen können auf diese Geschichten, andererseits aber auch sozusagen das Strukturelle erkennen in diesen Geschichten. Dadurch auch zu verstehen, wie funktioniert es eigentlich auch heute in einer demokratischen Gesellschaft, die aber nichtsdestotrotz von diesen Strukturen auch nach wie vor geprägt ist.
Vor allem als Samar mit dem Namen, mit meinem Aussehen, dann noch der religiöse Aspekt und dann noch eine Frau zu sein. Ich glaube, das sind so mehrere Punkte, die aufeinander kommen, die für einige ein Jackpot sind, loszulegen und rassistisch oder diskriminierend zu sein. Und ich finde, das bezieht sich auf heute genauso gut wie damals. Wie oft hören wir Geschichten von, ob es Jüdinnen oder Juden sind oder versklavten Personen, die wir mitbekommen haben, dass sie sagen, ja, und jeder hat zugeguckt. Keiner hat sich geäußert, keiner hat was gesagt.
Pay attention to what's going on politically in the US to this very day. A lot of times people feel like these policies being passed are not affecting them, so why should they care? But I also feel like something doesn't have to affect you personally for you to care. In high school, we were going over the Holocaust. We were reading a book called Night by Elie Wiesel. And we also read this poem that I'll never forget. The poem essentially said that first they came for the Jews, but I didn't care because I wasn't a Jew. Lately, at my job, this poem constantly replays in my head. Because individuals nowadays are saying, oh, I'm not an immigrant. Why should I care that they're locking immigrants in these detention facilities? Because when they're done with them, who are they going to go after next? So rage also comes in that format because people don't want to learn sometimes. And that's what I hate. The phrase ignorance is bliss has done a disjustice to our society. Ignorance is not bliss, ignorance is evil.
Ja, da merkt man so, sie wohnt am anderen Ende der Welt, aber hat die gleichen Gefühle wie ich, weißt du? So, das ist halt, da merkt man immer wieder, man ist nicht alleine, weißt du? Das ist ein Gefühl, das ich manchmal hier in Europa habe und mich frage, so, Alter, kriegt keiner mit, was auf der Welt passiert? Kann das einfach passieren und wir machen nichts? So, aber es geht nicht nur mir so, es geht ihr auf der anderen Seite vom Atlantik genauso. Ich glaube, wir fühlen uns beide manchmal nicht ernst genommen, wenn wir über Diskriminierung sprechen. Und dass wir auch beide dieses Gefühl teilen, dass man nicht dazugehören könnte.
Also ich sag mal so, das klingt jetzt vielleicht ein bisschen komisch, aber ich höre nur über Rassismus. Ich spüre ihn nicht am eigenen Leib. Ich bin super weiß. Ich kann mich dazu entscheiden, mich damit zu beschäftigen. Ich kann mich dazu, es ist eine aktive Entscheidung, sagen, ich beschäftige mich jetzt damit oder nee, ich kann mich dazu entscheiden, ob ich mir die Reportage oder die Doku weiter angucke oder ob ich meinen Laptop jetzt zumache.
Deshalb sollte vor allen Dingen ich mich erst recht mit dem Thema befassen. So, weil es sagt schon viel aus, dass man privilegiert ist, wenn man sagen kann, ist mir egal.
Es gibt so viele Menschen, die sich eingesetzt haben, aber die siehst du nicht. Ob in Geschichtsbüchern, in den Nachrichten oder die hörst du auch nicht. Und ich glaube, so ein Mensch sind wir oder diese Leute in der AG auch. In 100 Jahren wird es uns nicht mehr geben. Und vielleicht erinnert sich keiner auch an uns, aber vielleicht können wir einer Generation oder einzelnen Menschen etwas mitgeben, was sie dann mittragen können für ihr späteres Leben oder für die Generation, die darauf folgt.
Wir sind keine Expertinnen, wir sind keine Wissenschaftler, wir sind Lernende. Und ich bin auch nur Lehrerin und keine Wissenschaftlerin. Also wir sind da gemeinsam auf einem Weg.
Wir als AG haben schon viel gelernt. Es muss auch nicht innerhalb des Rahmens der AG stattfinden. Also wirklich, seid laut, seid nicht still. Nehmt euch auch das Vorbild der Amerikaner, auch aus New Orleans als Beispiel.
I think that you can really draw an inspiration from the past because the people that we talk about here, it's important to talk about them not just from a perspective of their victimization, but the fact that they were freedom fighters, that they fought to make their world better, that they fought to preserve their culture and their communities. That's really, really significant, and I think there's a lot to be inspired by when you think about history from that perspective.
Our problems is because of our lack of history and our lack of education. That's at the core. That's at the core.
The new generation need access. They need access to the knowledge. That's one of the very, very important parts. If they have access to the knowledge, maybe access to the archives, also access to the platform where they can act, they can express themselves.
Bin ich auch so stolz, dass ich das gesehen habe. Stolz in dem Sinne, dass ich davon erfahren habe, was dort passiert ist, damit mehr Menschen davon erfahren, weil nicht jeder hat den Zugang zu diesem Wissen. Also außerhalb Amerikas auch, würde ich sagen, ja.
Frau Schmidt hat eine extrem große Rolle gespielt. Also sie hat eine Tür geöffnet, von der ich nicht gedacht habe, dass ich da lande. Aber ich bin extrem froh, dass ich da bin, wo ich jetzt bin. Und mit dieser Denkweise und mit dem Wissen von dem Ganzen, was wir erfahren haben, arbeiten kann. Weil ich Themen kenne und Menschen kennengelernt habe, Kulturen, wo ich ohne diese AG niemals wäre.
Dieses Wissen über die Geschichte, das ist meine Waffe im Kampf gegen Rassismus und Unterdrückung.
Mit so einer Gruppe zu arbeiten bedeutet für mich, dass man gesehen wird, dass man gehört wird und dass man nicht alleine ist. Also ich würde mir wünschen, dass die Gesellschaft so wie die Gruppe ist, genau.
Die AG hat eine innere Struktur entwickelt. Ja, die Jugendlichen nennen es manchmal Familie. Was sie, glaube ich, damit meinen, ist, sich verantwortlich füreinander zu fühlen.
Die Gruppe verkörpert diese Menschlichkeit und diese Empathie, die der Gesellschaft fehlt. Das finde ich richtig bewundernswert und ich glaube, das macht die Gruppe auch so besonders und die Zusammensetzung der Gruppe so besonders. Der Mikrokosmos unserer Gesellschaft ist ja so ein bisschen die AG in der Zusammensetzung, in den Erfahrungen. Sie haben absolut die Möglichkeit, so diese Filter vielleicht auch zu durchbrechen und Leute aufzufordern und zu zwingen, genau hinzuhören und hinzuschauen auch. Aber bin mir ganz, ganz sicher, dass nur durch Allianzen, die wir bilden, eigentlich überhaupt eine Möglichkeit haben, demokratische Werte, für die wir doch alle stehen, zu verteidigen.
Also Samar spricht von menschlichen Handeln und also diese Menschlichkeit in den Vordergrund zu stellen und sagen, wir wollen eine menschliche, eine gerechtere Gesellschaft. Ich glaube, das ist das, was uns verbindet.
Ich finde, durch die Arbeit entwickelt man viel Empathie. Nicht nur wir, sondern die Leute, die auch zuhören und auf unsere Veranstaltungen gehen. Und ich glaube, also ich weiß, dass es vielen gar nicht bewusst ist, was wirklich passiert ist und durch unsere Arbeit das überhaupt klar gemacht wird.
Wenn man sich damit nicht beschäftigt, dann wird man auch nichts verändern.
If we don't look back at our history, see how far we've come, and see what was happening then we won't be able to stop or to recognize the patterns as they're happening now.
Im Mittelpunkt von jeder Art von Geschichte, ob es jetzt Genozid oder Holocaust oder genau Sklaverei ist oder die schwarze Geschichte, steht immer ganz oben oder sollte ganz oben für uns stehen, die Empathie und das Mitgefühl für andere zu entwickeln und auch weiterzugeben. Ich glaube, das ist so eine der Sachen, die heutzutage am bedrohtesten sind. Jetzt, früher, morgen.
Ja, gerne. Ich möchte gerne einmal die AG erinnern.
Yes, please come here. I invite all the members of the Remembrance Working Group and also Mrs. Schmidhals here on stage. First of all, I'd like to thank you. I found it really beautiful to see this film who's just been finished. And to be honest, I have many questions to you but I have to make it short, and I'd like to enter discussion with you very shortly. Sabbath, I'd like to start with you. Within the working group, you have first of all worked on Shoah, on National Socialism. I'd like to know how you extended your subjects to transatlantic slave trade. Well, what was impressive for me in the Remembrance Working Group was that the subjects were chosen by the young people, so they were developed from the first subjects. We traveled for the first time to Israel in 2015, and the young people said, after this trip, we want to continue working on the history, on the Shoah, on the Holocaust and National Socialism. And the first trip that we did to Oklahoma, MoMA was on presenting a remembrance culture in the USA, and it was the son of two survivors, Michael Kornblatt, who told us for the first time about the parables of the Kornblatt and the Nuremberg legislation, and he told about the story when his father led him through the city and said it was black only and white only. We came to the U.S., we didn't want to see this again. And Christy William, who's a survivor and a descendant of the Tulsa massacre, told us, we learned that in 1921, people were systematically bombed and killed by the state. So I found it totally comprehensible that the young people who have been working on the National Socialism for many years said, well, there's so many things that are similar. We went to Emestrasse, to this, we heard about the experiments and pseudo medical experimentation on human beings. We heard about the exhibition on racism, and we learned that all this is part of German history. We asked ourselves how much Germany is implied with this, is intertwined with all these crimes. So this interest continues to develop. And I think it's great that the young people really are interested in these subjects, want to learn about it. It's not about equality or the comparison of history. No, the story is about working on history, learning on history. Thank you, sir, first of all, for this comment. I'd like to ask another question on this. You talked about the Jim Crow laws and the Nuremberg racist laws. What other connections did you find out? Well, it feels like being in an examination here. Are there any connections? Well, connections on the spot. I think the idea of the human that we worked a lot on, we asked ourselves, maybe there were ancestors to the Holocaust in the ideas of what people were, the ideas, the image that you have about humans, meaning splitting up society and higher human beings, lower human beings, being worthy, being less worthy. This is something that was really hard for us to learn. Well, after passing this exam, I'd like to talk to you, the members of the remembrance groups. There are mics behind us. Please grab them, and I'll give you the mic if you want to intervene. First of all, and it's not included in today's plan, I'd like to ask you how you feel about watching this movie for the first time. We are proud of Moritz. Thank you. I think I can talk in the name of the entire room that Lily, Maria, Carlos, and they are all honorary members of our group. Thank you so much for your support. What about you? Well, I think the film is quite hard to watch, especially as we, as a group, we are not so serious. We can be quite funny, we sing together, we go even to funny places and have a lot of fun while doing very serious trips. Because when you work on history and these very hard and difficult stories, well, it's sad. Whatever it is, massacres or something else. The film shows very well how we felt about experiencing it. And also that we also had fun. We went into the streets, we talked to the people. Thank you. Well, I feel like being in a reawakening. The trip took place quite a while ago, and there was sort of a fire lit up again inside me to continue learning, to be open, to listen, and learn about other people. I kiss your heart, blessing. That was exactly what I was going to say. Whenever I see this film, I'm motivated again to continue. Well, it's not as serious or deep as I see it, but it's really all about a remembrance. And this movie is a remembrance about what we should do in life. I mean, there are phases in life when you said, well, I have to make money, I have to work, and whatever happens in the world, I cannot change the world. But when I watch this movie with a group, it really empowers us. There are many people, even you, all you here present, shows that there's so much interest. If everybody would do something together, there would be a real change in the world, even at a very small level, even only small things, but it would really change things. What I find quite remarkable in this movie is that you can see that not like in a classical sense, you learn about history, but you really encounter history. On the one hand, within yourself, as a group, on site. And I'd like to know what was the impact of this journey for you personally? How has it changed your own view of your own lives? I'd like to start. I would say that this trip has shown us how close history is to us, that each and everybody of us has a connection to this history. And I'd like to make the following remark. When we were on the ground, we have talked to so many people who carried in them so much love. There was no racism, no discrimination within them, and it gave me hope to also from the people and connections that I know here, that you don't only want the best for yourself, but also for the people around you, for the others, you know. The trip and the group and the work within the remembrance groups always shows me again and again to learn about this knowledge, get this knowledge and hand it over, especially in the situation, the geopolitical situation of the world currently. I believe that especially at political level, people certain people hope that some parts of history will not come up and not be consciously be discussed, and that what we work on is considered to be crazies. And I support what Blessing and Omar said. It gave me hope that it makes sense to learn about this, to get this knowledge, and to pass it on. For me, I wanted to learn more about my own history. We're at this site where we were at this signpost. So we were in front of the signpost. I wanted to show that I'm part of this history. And that was the point that showed me that I need to learn much more about my own history, maybe also to give an answer also to other people if they ask me questions about my origins, about my history, about myself. What I'd like to add to the discussion is what gives us is really this access access to this informal learning. It is also a study trip, but it is not something where you get notes, marks, or something. Mrs. Schmidhals also gives us the opportunity to learn what we want to learn, everybody individually. So we fix our own frameworks to exchange on it, to set our own perspectives. I said it in the movie, and I repeat it again. It's all the history of all of us. It is an echo across the Atlantic, as the title says. Those are stories that seems to be very far from each other, at the same time very, very close. So when I work on my own family history, I do not recognize myself in this own movie, but a lot of other connections with other stories from the past, from my family. Can I? May I? Yes, and we see what a privilege it is for us, for me personally, to work on the stories of people that you never met, that you, what an honor it is when other people come and give us their time, sacrifice their time, and that it's so great to form a community with them. I don't know how to describe this feeling. It really gives you a certain feeling, and you realize, oh, these people just come for us. They want to tell us their stories, the story of their ancestors. I think this is an extraordinary story, an extraordinary experience that we all share here, I believe. Well, indeed, I asked myself what the impact of the trip on me. It was not directly positive. Actually, I've become more frustrated and more angry thanks to this trip, and I think it's absolutely justified to be angry. Malcolm X and many others, Martin Luther King, were very angry, and this is how they changed society. It depends on how you use your anger. If you have people around you who channel this anger in the correct way, you can work on it. So to become more angry is, in a way, for me also quite a positive development in this sense. Moritz, to conclude, I'd like to ask you, you support this trip as a filmmaker, and obviously you have you're an honorary member of the Remembrance Group. So I'd like to know and be interested to know it's not only about learning. There's something else also that has happened. Well, it started much earlier. Of course, when I met Sabbath, in the very beginning, she told me it's all about the biographies of you, the members of the group. And this was something that I was very interested in. I was interested in you and your stories. Omar, Ryan, and all the stories of the group. And then we met Carlos, and in Berlin, when we were walking in Berlin, Carlos asked me, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "I'm a listener. I listen to people. I love to listen and to ask questions." And this is what motivated me during the many years to support this group. There was so much honesty, so much courage, so much despair also, and at the same time how we deal with each other within our society. Najaya or Joy, who opened their heart to us and told us their stories. It's not only necessary, it's my obligation as a filmmaker to use what they share with us and to use my methods, my technical methods to tell their stories. So I'm very thankful also for the trust by the group, by Carlos, Bernard, Joey, and Sabbath. And they gave us something that we talked about, that we discussed, that makes us even angry. As I said, there is something, there is a subject somewhere here between us in the world. As Carlos has said, we need to give them names. We have to tell the stories. If not, they are forgotten. And we don't want this. None of us wants this. Thank you. Before we start the panel discussions with our three guests, maybe it would be fair to give a huge applause to our remembrance group at Erinnern. Thank you.
Ich darf.
Well, now invite Carlos Hill, Joy Benners, and Bernard Tondi. Invite you to the stage. So before we start the panel discussions, I'd like to introduce our three guests here on stage. But first of all, I'd like to tell you that at the end, we will do a Q&A with our audience here. So if you have any questions or remarks, write them down so that we will discuss them at the end of our panel discussions. We have this opportunity here. Well, I introduce my guests here. I start on the other side. Dr. Carlos Hill is a professor for African and African American studies at the University of Oklahoma. He works on Black history, racist violence, and the echoes in the present. On Emmett Hill, he has worked on the Tulsa race massacres in 1924, on the transnational history for years. For many years, he supports and accompanies the remembrance group at Erinnern of the Theodor Heuss High School. Very warm welcome to you. Dr. Joy Gender is a co-founder and co-director of the Descendant Project in Louisiana. Together with her sister, he works for the descendants of the enslaved people of the so-called river parishes. She works on lands, historical equality, etc. He was known again in her work in the environmental destruction in the so-called Cancer Alley, and also the recognition of the enslaved people in the plantation museums and spots in this river valley. Directly next to me is there's Bernard Tondi. He's a historian, curator, and a storyteller from Tanzania, and he works in archives, public work. He works on the colonial traces of German colonialism in East Africa, and the question how remembrance is presented in the public. He is interested how films and the cultural practice can contribute to make well known this practice, colonialism, to especially to the younger generations. A very warm welcome to you as well. I'd like to ask a question to all of you, first of all. This movie shows how memories become intertwined when people encounter places, stories, and descendants. And I'd like to know, from your perspectives, what's the difference between the knowledge of histories and have a real link, a relationship with history?
Gut, werde ich als
I think the main difference between just knowing about history and having connection with it is caring about it. And so my work as a Black Studies historian is always about getting people to know, to care about the past and how it shows up today. That's where people build an emotive or a relationship of empathy, compassion to the history. And so it's about learning to care. And I think that's what the working group represents to me. They truly care about these histories and how it shows up. They also not only fight for remembrance, but also justice, memory justice. And so that only can happen when you're deeply compassionate and empathetic about not just the history, but the people connected to the history and wanting to make sure those histories, the legacies of those histories are confronted today. It takes compassion to do that. And so to the extent that our film creates a conversation, a healing conversation, we're doing that work. And so for me, it's about knowing why you care. That's what transforms your relationship to the past, from just knowing to actually caring and then doing something about. That's where it is for me.
Yes, and for me, if you've been following what's happening in the United States as well, and especially in my state of Louisiana, we've had some very frightening and very upsetting things that have been happening, including the Voting Rights Act that was passed when my parents were young adults, much like the students that were part of the film, which they thought they had fought a battle to get equal voting rights for the Black community. And so easily that has been torn away. And if we don't link what has happened in the past to what is happening now, then we're not recognizing the patterns of how we are in the situation that we are now, and we're not understanding the strategy to organize to make sure that we are empathetic and compassionate to people and to everyone in the world that's experiencing issues, because I think many of you probably realize that it's spreading. Injustice, just disdain, hate. And anger, it's spreading. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are being informed by history so that we can face it and we can make sure that we can take care of each other. Thank you.
I think on my side, it's a whole concept of why do we have to do it now? And I think that's where my work comes in. And for the past few years, of course, we know most of African countries have been engaging in this topic, for example. But I have been working, for example, for the past 6 years as a curator for films. And the only angle that I found that is made most important was this kind of films, screening films that brings about dialogical or spaces where people can question this thing. And I think this is the most important because when we try to talk about these topics, both slave trade and colonialism, what comes into mind is like most people think that this is something of the past. But for us who come from the continent of Africa, we understand that these are different stages. And now we have the neocolonialism. So neocolonialism didn't eradicate or didn't remove colonialism, but it's literally reshaped or repackaged it, So these are patterns. And until when we know why, or until when we start to confront these injustices and exploitation now, then we can be able to understand And we need to understand it by looking back from the colonial period and the slave trade and see how the patterns have been following each other for the past couple of hundreds of years.
Ich fand es gerade sehr interessant, euch zuzuhören, weil ihr
I found it very interesting to listen to you because you highlight different aspects. Carlos, you talked about the fact that it's very important to find an inner responsibility. Joy and Bernard, you highlighted that how important it is to connect the past with the present. How are the most important moments for you, for yourselves, to say, this is the work, this is where I want to engage myself, commit myself in?
That for me, I always say that I was reborn as a Black Studies historian in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Christy Williams, where are you, Christy? Where are you? There is Christy Williams here, a descendant of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. I call it, and many in that community call it, the deadliest attack on a Black community in American history. Getting proximate with that story, getting proximate with those descendants who carried that story forward and have sought repair for that story and that experience, that is where I was reborn. That is where I developed my why. As a remembrance activist. Remembrance activist is a term that I've begun to use only because I've been a part of a remembrance network that I was introduced to here in Germany. And so for me, getting proximate with descendant stories, understanding how that history shows up in their lives and in the community's life is where I was reborn. Because all of a sudden the history that I was teaching about in my classroom at the University of Oklahoma was not just a text-based history, it was a history being lived out in a community only about 90 minutes away from me. And that history of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, deadliest attack on a community, Black community in American history for 100 years hadn't been thought of as a massacre. It had been thought of as a riot, and being thought of as a riot, the community that had been destroyed was blamed for its own destruction. And so I learned through Christy and other descendants, right, the importance of fighting for calling it a massacre and all the weight that that term carried, all the justice embedded in that history, that word massacre. Remembering it as a massacre became so important to bearing witness to the truth of their experience, but also that the justice and the repair that they deserved. And so for me, getting proximate with descendant stories in the journey for justice that they've been on for 100 years is what gave me my deep why and transformed me as a Black Studies historian. It's the people that have carried the story, that have made sure that we didn't forget that story. The last thing that I will say, the reason why I have so much passion for Greenwood, its community and its history, is because, 100 years after the massacre, there's no reason why that community should be there, given what it suffered. Right, what was destroyed. But because the idea and the vision for what Greenwood stood for, it was bigger than the violence, the community rebuilt itself. And so I've learned through getting proximate with people like Christy, right, that the most important story is not just the story of what happened to it, but what it did in response to what happened to it. It rebuilt itself, right? It remained resilient in the face of violence. And so for me, carrying that story forward, the power of that story, the inspiration of that story, is what I try to bear witness to when I'm in audiences such as this. And so I was remade by that place. And to the extent to which I have affected any kind of change, it's owed to getting proximate to the descendant story.
Thank you, and Carlos. That's a beautiful sentiment for those of us who are of descendant communities. And I think you saw in the film that I absolutely love the community that I grew up in. I'm a descendant of people that were enslaved. I'm a descendant of German enslavers and their children. But we still have a community because of the culture that we created, a community that is lovely, that is thriving, and I don't like the word resilient, but resourceful, right, and determined. And for me, my why became very evident when I saw that my community was disappearing by industries coming in and deciding that we as Black communities, that we as Black descendants in our Freetown communities that we had created, that we just weren't worthy, that we weren't good enough, and that we should be replaced and removed. And what I saw, my role in it, I was a business professor for 8 years. And then I became the director of communications at Whitney Plantation, where my ancestors were enslaved. And then as I was giving the tour as the director of communications, I realized, wait, this is not that different. The institution of slavery is not that different than what I was teaching in business, right? And we get told so many times that our destruction, the destruction of these Black communities are necessary for economic development, right? And for progress and for growth. Well, as I have to remind people many times that slavery was economic development, right? And that didn't work out so well for us. So the why in this work is that while I think it is important to be a remembrance activist and to give the memory to my ancestors, to me, it is in vain if we are not using that memory to make sure that the people in the present are being taken care of. It gives people, thank you. And just lastly, I will say that I've seen the way that history is weaponized to say, well, at least you're not enslaved, right? And so what happens to your community now, it doesn't matter because you've moved on and look at you now. But again, we have to make sure that the history lives in the present. And I just want to say that I'm so inspired by the young people and the students. Man, if the world was governed with the amount of compassion and joy and love that I see modeled in you, we would have the world that we desire, that we dream of having. So I'm so admired. I'm in awe. I am awe. I'm so grateful to you.
Yeah, on my side, I think the idea or the question why, I remember when I graduated, I started working at the National Museum of Tanzania, and I was a history curator at the museum. And one thing that actually kept me sad was all the things that we had in strong room, for example, all the things that we had in storages. And for me I was always asking my question, like, why is this history being locked? You know, and I remember by the time I only worked there for 1 year, but I established something. It's what we call a Museum History Day. Exploration Day, Museum History Exploration Day, where I suggested that we could remove some of the things from the collections, and just because they never get a chance to be seen by anyone, just have an exhibition for like few days, and then we can still return them to the storages. And after a year, I was like, no, I think I need to do more. So then I went on, and together with my colleagues, we acquired the building from government, and we renovated the building from one of the, actually it was about to be, it was collapsing. So we got the money from the European Union, we renovated the building, and then we opened the first museum. And this is what we call the Dar es Salaam Center for Architectural Heritage. And basically, we wanted to put the whole history from pre-colonial societies, and we're talking about basically from 2nd century before Christ. So we had these interactions with the so-called the Greek and the Roman, then the Indian and the Chinese, then the Arabs and the Persians, then the Omanese, of course, and then the Germans, and then the British, and then, the post-independence during socialism era and the contemporary Dar es Salaam. So the idea was to bring all this history and show it to the people that we are who we are today because of this history. So this history shaped us who we are today. And after we opened the small museum, I also thought it wasn't enough. So I went on and created like almost 10 different type of tours that I still do to this day. So some of the tours that I do is like what you call, for example, the early architecture tour. So on the early architecture tour, we talk about Sultan buildings, and some of these were used during slave trade. We talk about German colonial building. We also visit British colonial building. So one street you can find multiple buildings that date back from different times. So you have both Sultan, then German, then British, then the 1960s, which is the socialism era, up to contemporary Dar es Salaam. So we do so many type of tours as a way of bringing these histories from locked archives and strong room in a museum to the people. Yeah.
Joy, Bernard hat gerade davon
Joey Banner has just mentioned that history has been locked up, and that it was one of the reasons for his start of working. This is what you say in the film, that you had no problem with the plantations, but you work in the plantations, but that it's important to you to speak truth about the plantations and what these buildings, what the site tells about the story. What is truthful, a truthful telling of the story for you?
So the Descendants Project, we actually have 3 plantations that we steward. One was recently donated to us because I say that my ancestors have a sense of humor. But seriously, the importance of of plantations are great great resources for teaching the history. And I don't want the United States to forget, right? And I want the United States to recognize that the boundaries of the plantation actually extend beyond the structure. And they actually extend beyond time to what is impacting those legacies of slavery for us today. And so the way that the accurate telling of plantation history is that this was an extractive, capitalistic system that was driven by, in many cases, greed, and it was driven by the minimization, the dehumanization of people as human beings. And I mean, we see many horrific ways in which Black people were brutalized. They were traumatized, but built a system, built a network of community that allowed them to, even today, give me the strength to deal with the many challenges that we have. I do feel as a resident of what's called Cancer Alley, so our risk of cancer is higher than 95% of the rest of the country. Most of the chemicals that you interact with every day that are dangerous for you, that are sometimes forbidden and outlawed in your countries, they are in my backyard, right? And so when we look at slavery, which had global reaches, right? And we have a responsibility now to address those legacies of slavery. And again, we would. A huge part of environmental justice and land justice for someone that's in Louisiana that seems far away from you will actually have a massive impact on climate change, on a reduction of emissions, and again, like being able to communicate, share stories, share strategies that will allow us to contend with the problems that that arise from what happens when we put power and profit over people.
Bernard.
Bernard, one member of the Remembrance group has just said that, yes, in this movie, the members work on the remembrance sites, and at the same time, you work on movies and remembrance sites. Why would you say that physical memorial sites and movies can be an important means to learn about history, especially colonial history?
Thank you. Well, I think film has this strong way to bring together people. So first of all, not only film, but also the spaces itself brings become dialogical, because this is the place where most people gather. And when people gather at one place, then they exchange their ideas. And sometimes they have different perspective. So and that's not very bad. It's also very important also. So it's one of the most important places because first, people meet, and then they can have, or they could exchange their different perspective regarding the history, but also as a way of confronting the history. But second, it also brings the past to the present. Imagine visiting a place, or maybe even learning about, let's say, for example, I'll take an example of where I've come from. Let's say we were told that, for example, millions of, let's say, between 6 to 10 million people exported from coastal cities of Dar es Salaam, and you don't see anything. How would you feel? How would you? It's just something that you read like in the newspaper. But visiting to these places, visiting to the dungeons where people used to be kept, and I think I also even saw on the film, one participant in the film saw this place where they were kept, this iron box, something like that. So this actually, I would say that places, including films and other ways, they bring the past on the present. So I think these are two main reasons why they should be used. Not only the places, but also the different other mediums should be used. Yes.
Carlos, in this movie, there is a moment when the terms of immigrant and settlers are discussed. Of course, it's all about the relevance of speech. I ask myself in the context of responsibility, but of your own work as well, what does language mean to you?
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful moments in the film is when we have that discussion about what is the true history of the United States. Is it a history of immigration, or is it a history of white settler colonialism? And I think the reason why wording or language is important, it helps us to really center what's really at stake, right? And so I mentioned earlier the main fight for narrative change that I was engaged in Tulsa was language, how we talk about it. Do we call it a riot that has a certain history, that has a certain group that it's centered? Or do we call it massacre and center what happened to the community, right? And how we maybe need to show up for the community today because it was a massacre and legacies from it linger. And so language, I feel, can obscure what really happened and what we need to do today in the present, or it can highlight, illuminate, right? And so I think language really, really powerful in the discussions that we were having about immigration or settler colonialism was all about talking about the historical development of the United States and whether or not freedom and democracy was something that that indigenous people experience, enslaved people experience, and their descendants by centering the history of white settler colonialism in the United States. That helped us to understand how, right, the history of slavery and dispossession shows up today. right? If we only talk about immigration, it creates a false kind of conception of how the history and the people today came about, right? And so for us, getting really clear about terminology, right? When we're at the Whitney plantation, instead of talking about slaves, we were careful to talk about enslaved people. We don't talk about slaves, we say enslaved, because language matters, right? If we're going to respect the humanity of enslaved people today, we can't talk about them in the same way that slaveholders talked about them. We have to use new language, new words, not to rehumanize them, but to recognize their humanity. And so much of the work today is to make sure that we talk about these histories in ways that not only are authentic, right, but respect the humanity of those who suffered most under it. And so language matters so much in terms of not just telling the truth, but healing, right, in relationships to these pasts. To the extent that we talk about slavery and enslavement in ways that the slaveholding class did, we're reifying, or we're bringing back to life those institutions that were meant to do harm. And so for us, language, creating a healing language, a healing discourse around slavery and the historical development of the United States, rooting it in understanding as a white settler colonialist vision for America, where slavery was central to economy, culture, politics, right? And understanding that, we can understand the gravity, the magnitude of how those histories show up today, right? In the form of anti-Black racism, in the form of, the fights for sovereignty in terms of Native nations today. All that matters when you start to think about white settler colonialism as the central focus of American history. So that is why for us, getting really grounded in the right way to talk about it was so important, and that's reflected in the film.
I really wish you would have invited me for that conversation about German immigrants versus German settlers. And Chrissy and students, y'all did a fantastic job in creating some eye-opening moments. And so I just I appreciate the kinds of lessons that they are getting. But I can't leave here without saying that as a Louisianian from the German coast, I do appreciate the sausage. I just would. And can we talk about, did y'all have good food in New Orleans, in Louisiana?
Yes, we did.
Okay, all right. I just want to remind, what Louisiana is so diverse. My favorite Louisiana dish is red beans and rice, which is a cultural dish from the Haitian immigrants. And so when you put the red beans and rice with the sausage, oh my God, you don't know what you're missing. And by the way, my parish, the county, is the sausage making capital of the world, and also the bonfire capital of the world as well. So again, thank you for the sausage.
Wissen für die nächste Party.
That's good for the next party. Joy, I'd like to connect with this. I see a connection with what Carlos has just said, this strong link with how this work is done. Carlos has talked about the language and the meaning of terminology, and when we talk about enslaved people, for example, but your focus in your work is also how relevant it is to take care that descendants of enslaved people become actors in remembrance work. And the questions that I'd like to ask you, also in your own work, is what changes? What is changing in reality, also in a material ways, when the descendants become real actors in this remembrance work?
So transparently, it is difficult at times to have descendants telling the story of their history, having them actively participate, because it is trauma that we are asking, or we are saying that it's important for us to face, or for someone to put themselves through this historical trauma when they are at the moment living with the impacts of present day trauma, right, in all of its forms. So it is, again, to have that descendant voice, because there is a relationship to the plantation sites, because these sites, because we also there were places of trauma, they are also places of culture, right? And so my attachment, my relationship to a plantation is different than a lot of the Black community who is not proximate to it, right? Because that plantation is, yes, it's a labor camp, but then it is also, well, I had community members that were there. You know, there was a community. There are still people in Louisiana that have taken the slave cabins and have renovated and restored and repaired them, but they are in those cabins, just like they're in the plantation houses, right? So those sites carry many memories. They also carry the artisanship, the craftsmanship, the skill of our ancestors. Just case in point, I was a director of communications at Whitney Plantation when Hurricane Ida hit in 2021. And me and my family, we did not evacuate. We normally do, but that time, my parents are a bit older and nervous after the pandemic, so we didn't evacuate. That morning when we woke up and felt that we had not made the wise decision, I said my only alternative is let's go to Whitney Plantation. And that house has withstood storms, and I forgot how many hundreds of years it is. So we rode out 16 hours of a plantation in that plantation house, right? And then so we have this overarching story of climate and climate change and climate impacts, and the effects that are happening, that are worsening in Louisiana because of capitalism, because of fossil fuels, because of plastic production. So again, it's one of those ways why I think it is important for descendants to be a part of the work, because they can see those nuances and make those connections that may seem irrelevant, but they are literally impacting the world today.
Bernard, wir waren gerade...
Bernard, in the previous two questions, we talked about the how, and your work, I'm interested in knowing on what. When we talk about colonialism, and you have a very close look at Dar es Salaam and Tanzania, and if you've mentioned it yourself, the different actors, Germans, English, British, etc. But there was also the era of socialism, for example. I am interested in the perspectives that you lack in international work on colonialism and remembrance work. What's lacking?
I mean, thank you so much. There's so many things that are lacking. First of all, the story itself about the East Africa, where we are talking about transatlantic slave trade. More often, we forget that slavery didn't only happen in West Africa, but in different parts of the continent. We had trans-Sahara slave trade before, and the East African slave trade started longer before the West African slave trade started, and it even existed longer after the West African slave trade was abolished. For example, to this day, when you ask a historian, especially from the continent, like when was slavery abolished in East Africa? I bet you 9 out of 10 times they will tell you exactly year. While we have the official year, but slavery continued. For example, the British and a few other European powers did the so-called abolition of slave trade. But what they did, they just abolished exporting slaves out of the continent, but they allowed slave labor within the continent. To this day, you go to different archives and different museums, you see a lot of pictures during the German period, for example. that people are chained and all that. And when you ask historians, they fail to tell you whether they were slaves or prisoners, because slave labor continued even during the colonial period. And we're talking about 12 million people who were, exported from West Africa to the Americas. But we, most of the time, don't tell how many people died during the process, And this is also very important for a case of East Africa, talking about 6 to 10 million people. But how many people died during the process? And something that is completely different from West Africa slave trade. Most of the slaves from East Africa were never transported without being castrated, so that they can legally produce in these countries. So that way, most of the people died, during the process, not even before they have started shipping them to the other part of the world. So most of the cases also we think, the East African slave trade was mostly slave taken to Balsa, for example, to Western India, for example, to Iran, for example, to Oman, to Yemen. But forget that. In 15th century, the Portuguese are already there. And they control the coast of East Africa, starting from Sofara in Mozambique, going to Kirwa, to Zanzibar, going to Lamu, Gadi, Malindi. To this day, you can find hundreds of ports and port cities, but also you can find so many forts also. You go to Mombasa, you can find Portuguese forts. You go to Kirwa, you can find Portuguese forts. So they control the whole East Africa coast for more than 125 years. And this time also, slaves were still one of the very big thing. And of course, after the so-called abolition of slave trade, led to the to the creation of what we call colonialism. So in slave trade, the most important thing was human labor. So it was control of the people. But after they got a lot of economic wealth, then they were okay, let's move to the continent. Not only that we have to control people, but we have to control the land. So it also increased. And most people forget that there was so many similarities, and there still are a lot of similarities, between colonialism and slave trade. Both used African as for forced labor. Both of the system used racism and the so-called I don't have the good English word for that, but they used racism in a way to justify saying that, Africans, we have to civilize them, blah, blah. There's so many things that they're less inferior to us and all that. But both also, for example, used violence. When we talk about slavery, we see how people were, captured, for example. And that's why you have a lot of accounts, for example. King Alfonso, for example, King Zinga, wrote to the Portuguese king, King João, and telling him that, please don't send traders because they're taking people, they're killing people and all that, but instead send missionaries and teachers. And these are like early accounts showing that even African kings were also resistant to this. And there are so many examples. But during the colonial period, yes, they actually think expanded. So instead of controlling the people, so now you control the people and the land. And after the end of colonialism, there comes also another system, which is the neocolonialism. So we control people through land and resources, That's why we have a lot of examples that you can tell. Most of African countries are still under the so-called, they're still fighting for the so-called economic independence. For this day, for example, 3/3 of South Africa is owned by the white settlers. How did they acquire this land? It's through colonialism. We're talking about Kenya. Last few weeks ago, there was a very, very interesting story about this white woman. I think she's from Italy, if I'm not mistaken. She owns a land which is bigger more than Nairobi, the whole city of Nairobi. And how did she acquire the land? And countries like Tanzania, for example, had so many problems. I will give you a very simple example. Right after we got independence, we had a very, very bad diplomatic relation with the Belgians. Why? Just because, for example, during the German colonial period, they built the railway, which is the so-called the Central Railway. And after the end of the First World War, German lost. And then British got most part because the former German were redivided again. So Rwanda and Burundi was assigned under the Belgians. So some part of the northern Mozambique was assigned under the Portuguese, and the remaining part was assigned under the British. But the Belgians were not happy. Were not happy that they got small colonies, Rwanda and Burundi. So they wanted big portion. What did they do? They wanted to wage a war with the British. And the British were like, you know what? We don't have to fight. Let's find a way to settle this. So the only thing that they settled was, we will give you a permission for 99 years where you could use the Central Railway, from the Congo, on the border between Tanzania and Congo, all the way to the port of Dar es Salaam. And in the port of Dar es Salaam, we give you also another section where you could export and import anything for 99 years. So you have a port for 99 years, then you also have a railway for 99 years. And a few years later, we got independence. When we got independence, the Belgians were like, oh, you know what, we want to continue using this because we have 99 years lease. 99 years to continue using this. So you can imagine we have so many things that are happening, and they have been happening from the time that we got independences. We can talk so many examples. Most of the 15 countries, for example, African countries, are still the former, for example, French colonies. They still are forced to keep more than 50% of the currency reserve in the French National Bank. So there are so many contracts which are signed and which are still affecting most of the countries in the continent. And these are have all their roots from the slave trade. From the very changes, it's actually changes the form. But I think what is more important is bringing all these important discussion to the audiences. Yes.
Carlos, sorry.
You remembered something also. You also asked what is missing also. Also, another thing that I think is missing is the idea that because most of stories we also read, they are Eurocentric stories. And what is missing also is Afrocentric stories. So everything we learn is which was written by the colonizers, and so we have a Swahili word. Not Swahili, but it's more like an African proverb. They say, "Until when the lion knows how to write, or the stories will glorify the hunter." So I think what is missing is African or Afrocentric perception in stories. And because we don't have that, that's why we lack stories, for example, stories of resistance. Everything we talk about, colonialism and slave trade, is trying to show victim, but they don't tell stories of resistance, showing that Africans, for example, African chiefs and others, were also resistance and stuff like that. So because we don't have Afrocentric stories, that's why we also lack some stories, including the resistance stories.
Can I respond quickly to the importance of those stories? Growing up in Louisiana, my grandparents would recite to us in what we call Creole French, which is a combination of very old French and combined with African and probably some German and indigenous words in it. But it was important that they passed along this story that we call Compère Lapin, which becomes Br'er Rabbit to more modern audiences, I think in the 40s or 50s, and then really was the inspiration, I believe, between Bugs Bunny, right? But those original tales were from West Africa, and it was all the ways in which this bunny would be able to, or the animals were able to face resistance and outsmart the hunters. And so I really believe that, me and my sister growing up with those tales of resistance is the way that we're able to stay creative, is the way that when we face a huge challenge, the idea of there's the ability to resist, and then there is enjoyment in the resistance, and so we have found that those those African tales of resistance, the ones that were shared among our ancestors, are still teaching and informing the work that we're doing now. So I appreciate again the link between that heritage and that culture and the way it inspires us today.
Carlos, ich möchte noch eine abschließende Frage an dich stellen, bevor wir...
Carlos, I'd like to ask you a concluding question before we pass on to the Q&A. Just on resistance. Your focus was on racist violence and different forms of racist violence, for example, the transatlantic slave trade, the Tulsa massacre, and the concrete example of the murdering Emmett Till. I'd like to know, in your work with the group, as you worked on these different contacts, I'd like to know what common points, what resistance you found there in your work with them.
I think I understand the question. I would say that the connection between those histories and the connection that I really focus on is how those histories capture are manifestations of a long history of anti-Black racism and violence. And so where I try to spend my time and what I try to confront, if I'm confronting anything, in the classroom, on the lecture circuit, talking to different campuses, not just my own, but also in writing about these histories, what I'm trying to confront is two things, and how these histories are connected for me is we have often misremembered the histories of slavery. We've misremembered the histories of racial violence, referring to them as riots versus as massacres. The reason why we have misremembered these histories, we often don't center victims, survivors, and descendants. And so my work in terms of remembrance becomes about what are we centering, who are we centering, and for what end. For me, my end often is justice for victims, survivors, descendants, but also for the community in which it happened, not just the descendants or those who were most harmed, but for the whole community, healing for the whole community. And I think that healing that I'm in search of is about confronting indifference. Indifference is not just ignorance, it's a lack of the ability to have compassion for an experience that you don't think is yours. And so the most important thing that I try to work toward or to get people to confront is how is their effective relationship to the past, why they care or don't care. Because it's important to say why we don't care about things. It's just as important to say why we care. And so for me, what's most important in what connects these histories and what makes it the thing that I'm confronting is indifference, right? I think that indifference to these histories is what creates ultimately our deepest problems, right, in confronting the legacies. As long as we don't care about the histories, it's hard to do something about the legacies and how it show up. And so confronting that indifference is what, doing remembrance work to me is all about. I just want to say one more thing. I must say this, I'm a native Louisianan, similar to Joy. Instead of being born in New Orleans, though, I was born upriver. I was born in the Louisiana Delta, and in being born in the Louisiana Delta, I am a descendant of enslaved people who left the Alabama Black Belt and who migrated after slavery to Louisiana and I was remade by Louisiana Creole culture, but also French culture that traveled up and down the Mississippi River. New Orleans is at the southern tip of that, but northern Louisiana, where I grew up, right, is a part of that culture as well. And so we are truly connected in so many ways, not just through remembrance work, but that's what I would say in terms of what I'm seeking to connect and confront in the historical remembrance work that I do.
would like to introduce to you Awet Tesasius, who will give us a few words. Awet Tesasius, she is a cultural and political speaker of the Green Party. She is immigrated with her family from Eritrea, and before becoming a member of parliament of the German Bundesrat, she worked on social and immigrants law. In 2021, and that as a wages as was the first black woman elected to the German Federal Parliament, and ever since she's been very committed on participation, cultural communication, integration. Very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I have prepared a small speech, but I am so impressed by the movie and about your contributions, and I felt so concerned with my own experience as an adolescent here in Germany when I learned about the National Socialist and when I was only 15, only 4 years in Germany. And that was the moment when I saw the connection between my history and this story that you told here. My grandparents told us, yes, we also participated in the Second World War. The people from Senegal were sent to the French fighters, and we were obliged by the Italians and the Germans to fight on the other side. There is a connection. We have something in common. We can talk about it. Well, we talked a story. I was told a story there where my family, my culture plays no role. I think it's something that we lack. It is an opportunity we miss out on. I think connections can be born. It's a huge opportunity if we can make these connections take place. And ask myself, and that's the first question, what does this story has to do with me? What is my place, my connection with the National Socialist history? Of course, I know a lot about war, about all these stories. And unfortunately, my school didn't create this bridge with my story, but I build it myself with my family. This is why I find this film so important. There was a sentence in the movie. It is important to be humane. It seems to be so banal, so simple. You can express it in whatever you want, but it's all about it. You could say empathy, caring is important, or with the words of these wonderful Margaret Friedman said, be a human. It's all about this. Be a human. Recognize these connections. I think remembrance work and culture has a huge power to create these bridges, these connections. Well, at the moment, I often have the impression that they only it's rather separates us. But if we recognize these positive powers, what it makes with us, and how we can find each other, because these subjects are not African, American, European subjects. They are global subjects. History is connected. These connections bring us together. My message would be, this is what we should do. Unfortunately, the politics, the current policies has not really reached out on that. You succeeded in doing it. Really wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your work. Well, I announced that you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. This is the moment. So I look at our audience. Who wants to take the floor and ask your questions? There's somebody in the back of the room. In the back of the room. Yes, my question is to Carlos and Joy. In Germany, you hear a lot about the financial cuts and diversity programs, anything working on fight against racism. Are your programs also affected under the Trump administration? Does it make your work more difficult? How do you deal with these financial cuts for your work, if that's the case?
So gratefully, we did not receive, none of our funding was from the federal level, from those grants. I will say that we, along with other descendant groups along the Mississippi River in Cancer Alley, we were working together on a grant that was between 3 or 4 groups. We would have split $20 million. And that money was going to go exclusively for a climate resilience hub, so that after major storms or in heating events, we would have the ability to take care of the community by providing cooling stations, powering stations. We had the mobile ability to be able to take care of the community, because as someone who has been on the grounds right after a hurricane, we all recognize that, it took, within that first week, that sometimes you may or may not be reached by services. And we applied for it under environmental justice opportunities under the Biden administration, and we submitted an administration's changeover, and we still are waiting for an answer. But I would assume that answer is no, because it's been 2 years now and we haven't heard anything back. So all of that money has been cut. Mm-hmm.
I would say your inclination is correct. Higher education, colleges and universities have been in the crosshairs of this sort of war on, whether we call it a war on memory or a backlash to diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory. There has been sort of a financial dimension to it. And, at the University of Oklahoma, where I am teaching, the histories of racism, slavery, et cetera, my department is truly in the crosshairs and has been threatened with defunding and actually dismantling a department that has been in existence for 50 years and have graduated, hundreds of students, and has really created conversations on campus that no other department does, and represents a certain kind of not only history but impact for the university. A university that from 1890 to 1950 excluded Black people, and only after that did it make it possible for Black people to attend and live on campus, and that happened again over time. And so that same university with that legacy is doing very similar things today under this climate. And so it's been, not only a feeling of precarity because of funding has been threatened, it's really led to really low morale among faculty. And I've begun to see faculty in areas connected to diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory begin to leave, the university. I stay and I fight the fight because I am really, there is no place in America where this isn't an issue. And so I can flee from Oklahoma maybe to another institution. It'll be a fight there that may be different. But I stay because I'm so connected to the remembrance work. That work is so important to me. I'm not going to allow this current moment to upset that or to take away my focus from that. But yes, it is a true reality that I have to, as well as many others in this space, in this world, have to negotiate right now.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, one to the panel, and the other question is to the remembrance group. First of all, the panel. There was a mutual learning process. You could see it in the movie. I would really very much interested in your work because the remembrance group was so diverse. What kind of perspective has been retained in the remembrance work? I would like to ask the group, how do you feel remembrance work is done in America, in the USA? And because we have a lot of remembrance work also in Germany. In the recent history, we have a lot of racial attacks as well. In different, I would like to know how you learn from each other and what impact on your perspective and development of your own remembrance work. I will try to repeat the question. So, how we learn from the Americans, that was your question? What did it do to yourself or belonging to your community? It is about sharing questions, etc., sharing stories concerning racism, and racism can be felt in Germany. And how do you? What have you learned from the American remembrance work as Germans? Because you are Germans, even if you're diverse. What did you retain for yourself, for your own remembrance work?
Ich muss kurz nachdenken.
Maybe you first.
What I've learned in Germany in the Virgil, in the Summer Forum, but also in America, is a word that is Sankofa, I think. Is that correct? Sankofa, if I remember that correctly, means that you look back also positively in the past, and in spite of this difficult, hard past, you try to keep something positive for yourself, even if the past was very harsh for you, very bitter.
As part of Widening the Circle has been very informative and very even perspective shifting on memory work. Being able to see the sites, the way that history is remembered, and also the way that history still hurts. And, also understanding the need for humility and recognition of even when we don't intend to hurt people, in the ways in which we show up, that hurt can sometimes happen. And I think when we are doing the work and wanting to impact change, I think it's always necessary for us to leave space for the person that we think is the enemy, right? Because it's within that pain might be the thing that's driving their anger towards you and towards society. And that has, I will admit, that can be a struggle at times when I see people, in the United States, and I'll be frank, especially, white men who I feel have a lot of privilege and who do have a lot of privilege, but there is pain there. And it's important for me to recognize that pain because that privilege is founded on anger, is founded on extraction, is founded on lack of identity, lack of culture, and that's a hole that's missing, right? And so I think if we can do the hard work of looking at, this, I don't like to have to think that I need to take care of someone who I feel is in privilege, who has more privilege, but sometimes that is part of the necessary work in order to free us all. So I think I kind of answered your question. I hope so, but thank you.
I think I now understood the question correctly, finally. I've just passed my A-levels. I finished high school, and one of the questions during my final exam was in which way the German colonialism has an influence on modern medicine. And for example, I learned it also thanks to learning about the history of the USA. There are so many hidden aspects that you do not know about when you do not actively seek for it. For example, Cancer Valley, that it is hides a whole system where people are systematically subdued. And so I was really inspired about all this interesting subject. So it really helped me also to pass my final exams at school.
Sorry. I mean, I was just trying to add more. I mean, I like the point she raised that some of the things you won't really understand them until when you dive deep and try to learn more. I mean, you mentioned about Cancer Valley, but of course, there's so many examples. I wish I was in the same exam. Then I could give so many examples. I mean, we have a lot of stories back in my country about people like Robert Koch and many other people, and many diseases like tuberculosis and how these bacteria were discovered. But if I would be correct to answer your question, just in a nutshell, I joined this group in the last stages when I got an invitation to be featured in the film also. And when I saw the first draft of the film, I knew that there is something that I really is not missing in the film, but missing for us as human. And then when I remembered the concept that most of African communities survived on during both slave trade and also during colonialism. For example, during colonialism, we had different actors, and we know the work of the missionaries and all that. So some group of missionaries saw a group of kids who were praying, and then they saw a need of trying to make them lace each other. So they brought sweets, and they actually kept the sweet on one end, and they told the children to just learn. Whoever would be the first one would take the sweets. And the kids didn't learn. Instead, they held hands each other, and they all went as a group, and they divided the sweet together. So when the missionary asked them, why did you decide to divide all this? One of the kids replied, he said, I am because we are. So the concept of humanity is just because we are, I am because we are. And I was very, very happy when I saw the group from different migration background working together. And this brings about the concept of the so-called Ubuntu in African language.
At this point, I'd like to thank our panelists, but also, of course, to our remembrance group. And for the last time, I hand over the floor to Kerstin Krampe. Well, it's not the end of remembrance, and of course, it's not the end of this evening. There are many questions still. I invite you to continue the discussion informally. Thank you so much for Josephine, for the wonderful moderation. I thought it was very relaxed, and thanks so much to the panelists. We've learned so much. We really profited from your presence and these exchange with the remembrance activists and all this huge audience. Well, you came to do your work. It was very enriching for us to share all this knowledge with us. Thanks to Carlos, Joy, and Bernard for coming here. As you all know, it's not so easy to get visas these days. So we've hoped until the very last day that you got, and Bernard was very patient when waiting for his visa. So we are especially grateful for having him here tonight. And He reminded us of the very important African concept, an African concept of community, and it was wonderful to have also the Afro-American and Creole perspective from Louisiana. I invite you for a snack and continuing your conversation later on. Thank you for being here in such a great number. Thanks a great for your work to the Remembrance Group. Thank you for your voices, for your contributions, for being here. Thank you so much to the wonderful interpreters who loved to support this linguistically, has helped us to understand each other. And at the very end, I would like to ask Clara to thank Maria, who has not only accompanied this trip. Maria Kent has organized the entire project and has also inspired us. She accompanied this journey. Thanks to all of you and have a great evening. Thanks you.